stand for a moment of silence. Thank you, sir. Thank you. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, next we will have a presentation on the proposed fiscal year 2023 annual operating budget as presented to us by CFO Ms. Ramona Bivens and CFO Deputy Dennis Johnson.
Okay.
Please proceed, ma'am.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair. This is our required public hearing on the FY23 proposed budget, and also because we had requests from a commissioner to give a model or discuss on the public safety additional increase. Mr. Johnson is going to present that piece after I finish the budget, and then we'll take any questions from you and or from the commissioners and or the audience. In accordance with OCGA, the board is required to adopt an annual budget each year. When we adopt the budget, we adopt a total budget. And the county budget operates through 6 fund types. We have the general operating fund, which is our main fund. That's where our day-to-day operating expenses occur. We have a special revenue fund, which are those objects that are dedicated to a specific purpose. By law, we can't use them on anything else. Of course, the capital projects fund, that's where our SPLOST dollars are for all of our capital projects, debt service for any debt that we may incur, our internal service funds, and our enterprise funds. Oops, I'm going too fast. So I want to start with a little bit about some economic conditions. First, from a local perspective, the Office of Economic Development provided some information that 628 total jobs have either been created or committed during the last year. This shows some of the companies and then the number of jobs that were either created or committed during this past year.
I'm assuming that's fiscal year.
Yes. Also, the local economic conditions, unemployment rate is at an all-time low. It's lower than pre-pandemic rates, and it's definitely lower than during the pandemic. As you can see, I went too far. There we go. So as you see, pre-pandemic, we were at 4.4%. It spiked up to 16.2%. Last year it was down to 6.6%, and as of April, we were at 3.5% unemployment rate. So data shows that we have fully recovered from the employment perspective. However, there is still a labor shortage, as many people are simply not returning back to work as businesses have opened. On a national outlook, what we're hearing the economists talk about, that inflation has had a large impact on our cost of providing services. Inflation rate has continued to increase over the last 12 months, and it's at an all-time high of 8.5% in March and April, and that's the highest the nation has seen in decades. Consumers have seen prices rise by 8% or more in some areas. And what really stands out when you look at this chart, if you look at January, February, March, and April, where we were last year, to compare it to where it is this year at that time. So you can see how it doubled, in some places tripled, quadrupled in those areas of inflation. So because of that, we have had some, there's been an impact on our cost. So the multiple components that have contributed to the inflation, of course, the pandemic, we had supply chain delays due to ports being closed. When people were sick, they had to shut them down or didn't have enough workers. So, of course, Economics 101 is when the demand is high, supply is low, the prices go up. So that's kind of what we're experiencing with those increases. And again, we talked about the labor shortages. Also, due to the war in Ukraine, we have increased oil and energy prices. Of course, that equals increased fuel costs. So for the county as well, we are bearing the same cost as our citizens are for us to provide those services, because for the emergency vehicles to operate requires fuel, so we're paying more for that. We're also paying more for some of the parts for repair and maintenance on vehicles. In order to kind of combat the inflation, the feds have made some incremental rate increases, and they're anticipating a 0.5% increase each month. And what that's going to do, though, is going to probably impact the ability for many people to buy homes as the rates increase, because their mortgages will be higher. And we're looking at some of the homes that have been built. People might not be able to buy them. And Dennis is going to speak, Mr. Johnson's going to speak to that later on. Also, they're projecting an economic slowdown or potential recession coming up. So that's why we have to be even more prudent in being mindful of any additions that we want to make to our budget above our current levels, because we will need to be able to sustain that in future years. We received a preliminary tax digest on March 28th, and it shows that we've had some increases. There have been a significant digest growth from last year to this current fiscal, this year that we'll be using for the fiscal year. And as you can see, it went from 9.2 billion to 10.6 billion, and that's a 14.6% increase from values from last year. And as you can see, from starting in fiscal year 18, actually it started back in 14, went down a little in 15, and it's increased every year except for 16 when we had, 17 when we had a small decrease. So when those values go up, the assessed values go up, that can cause a property increase, property tax increase for citizens. Not necessarily the millage rate, but because of the values of the homes. And as I did this chart because I wanted you to see how the millage rate trend has been over the last 10 years as well. While the values have increased, the board has made a conscious effort to kind of offset a little of it, even if we couldn't do all of it, by decreasing the millage rate since 2019. We've had 3 decreases in the millage rate and proposing another decrease. So you can see that it went from 16.596. We decreased it 1 full mil to 15.596. The next year we went to 15.089, a little over half a mil reduction. Last year we reduced it by about a third, and this year we're recommending a quarter millage rate reduction for the year to 14.496. Also on the sales tax revenue, this is just showing how the increases and decreases over the past 10 years. So as you can see, in 2018, we were almost at $40 million. In 2019, that was the fiscal year of 2019. That was the first year we felt the impact of the sales tax reduction due to the aviation fuel tax. In 2020, because of COVID, on top of that, that was and we had a slight reduction there. But as you can see, in 2021, we have rebound from those incidences, and in 2022, we're projected to end about $38 million, $38 million, and for 2023, we're projecting about $38 million in sales tax. So for property tax revenue, based on the preliminary digest that we received, the net values again increased by 14.6 or $1.3 billion. As I stated, we're recommending reducing the millage rate, the base millage rate, by 0.42 to 18.111. So once we apply the loss credit, which is actually a little lower, 1.174 lower than the previous year, then the proposed net millage rate is 14.496. Which is a quarter mil lower than the previous year, and this is what the budget is based on. This will result in tax bills of $153.7 million with a net collection of $148.8 million, which is we're using a 97% collection rate to account for any potential uncollectible taxes. The tax assessor sent out the assessment notices on April 29th. I'm sure everyone has received theirs. I know we received ours, and I've heard some comments from citizens about how the values have gone up. June 13th is the date to file an appeal if you want to appeal that assessment to try to have it lowered. Any changes to the digest, if there's an increase that has a positive effect, what we consider a positive effect, which is increase in revenue, a decrease in the digest would have a negative impact, which would decrease the revenues. Oops, all right. Okay. Some of the challenges that we had for FY23 in doing this budget, usually we have revenue-related challenges, but this year was different. We had expenditure challenges, mostly again due to the inflation and cost increases. So We, in an effort to maintain the county's strong financial position through efficient use of current resources, we wanted to ensure that this budget addressed the board's priorities that are included in the strategic plan and continue to provide services that contribute to an active, healthy, and informed community. This budget increased about $24 million over our current year budget, and mainly it's due to cost increases with inflation, the supply chain, which has an overall increase of cost of the county providing services. We have automobile parts for vehicle repair and maintenance. We're seeing increased cost in those. We're seeing increased cost in building supplies and large capital goods, as well as general supplies and fuel, as well as charges for services. Earlier in the year, the board had to approve our excess liability insurance. I think that increased by about $700,000, if I recall. And then also the inmate medical cost, we've added about $3 million for those additional costs as well that we have to provide those services. This proposed budget, again, includes maintaining the current funding level. Some of the items that we've added are pay enhancements of $10.3 million for public safety. The first responders, you all approved the 10% back in January, I believe. They have received the 5% at the end of April. The other 5% will go into effect July 1 for a total of 10%. All other public safety employees will receive a 5% cost of living adjustment, and all other employees outside of public safety will receive 3% COLA. We also included merit increases in the amount of $2.4 million for eligible employees on their anniversary dates. It will be banded as 3 tiers, so those with salaries from up to $40,000 will be eligible for up to 5% on their merit based on their ratings. Over 40,000 up to 80,000 are eligible to receive 3.75% as a maximum amount, and those over 80,000, 2.5%. This budget also includes funding to increase the minimum hourly rate to $15 an hour in the amount of $2.1 million for full-time and part-time employees. We have $1.7 million in personnel additions for various departments, and then additional funding to provide, to continue providing services. Again, those cost increases across all departments amount to about $6.5 million, again, for the fuel, vehicle repair and maintenance, inmate medical, other contracted services, building and maintenance, capital supplies are just some of those areas. And then we also included $1 million to supplement SPLOST vehicle purchase for vehicle replacements for transportation and development. So with all of that, we're projecting our beginning fund balance to be $90.8 million. Our total revenues, $252.4 million. Expenditures, $259.7 million, which leave a shortage of revenue of $7.3 million, which we will be using fund balance to make up that difference. So next year, we're projecting our ending fund balance at $83.5. Part of that $7.3 million is for some of the public pay enhancements that we discussed back in January that we will use fund balance to use for that, some of that, as well as the some one-time capital needs that we have in there. The general fund revenues by source, on here you can see the dark blue shaded area shows the majority of our revenue, which is property taxes. So you can see for each year, the majority of the revenue is made up of property taxes. The orange area is other taxes and assessments, which is where the sales taxes are included in that total. For the property tax for this year, again, as I stated, is $150 million. And then for other taxes and assessments, $63.5 million, which is 24.45% of the total budget. And I want to back up about property taxes. That's 57% of our total revenue. The remaining revenues come from other sources that are shown, just charges for services, license and permits, fines and forfeitures, intergovernmental revenue, a very, very small amount of interest and dividend income, and those are all less than 10% each for those areas. This shows a comparison of our current year budget of $235.4 million compared to our proposed budget, and you can see this is by category. So the blue area is for courts and law enforcement, which includes our sheriff's office, jail, courthouses, those areas that fall up under the sheriff, as well as in the brownish shaded area is for public safety. That's police, fire, EMS, EMA, and all other public safety. So the majority, as you can see, 33% of our budget this year It's going for courts and law enforcement. That's the largest part of the budget, with 22% for public safety and 29% for general government, which is the daily operating expenses for all the other services. So again, as I stated earlier, this is $24 million increase over our current year's budget. When we look at the expenditures by types of expenditures, we have our personnel services, debt service, operating expenses, other financing uses, capital outlay. You will see that as it has been historically and in most businesses, that personnel services is the largest fund with expenditures that we have on the types. So you see 65.3% of the $259.7 million that we're proposing is in salaries and benefits for the employees. And that includes the increases that the board had approved prior and some more that are recommended in there. 32.4% of it is for the operating expenses. Again, that's for all other services that the county provides. So just to recap on the proposed budget again, we're projecting $90.8 million would be the beginning fund balance. Of all the revenues, $252.4 million, $259.7 in expenditures. We'll use $7.3 million of fund balance, and that will leave us an estimated ending fund balance at June 30th, 2023 of $83.5 million. When we adopt the budget, the board is required to, oops, I went too far. The board is required to adopt a total budget which includes all funds that I mentioned earlier. The general fund in the amount of $259.7 is proposed. That's 65% of all the budget funds. Special revenue funds, $54 million. Capital projects funds has zero there now, but as we've done in the prior years, it shows zero, but the board approved as part of the current year budget, those projects that were approved will roll forward, and so they will be budgeted at that time. Also, any additional projects or sites for constructions that are identified and approved by the board will be budgeted and out of the reserves for SPOST. Internal Service Fund, we have $78 million. The Debt Service Fund is $2 million. We have Enterprise Fund of $4 million. And then total all funds that we will be requesting to adopt will be $397.9 million. So in order to add additional items to this proposed budget, a few things would need to occur. We would have to identify some additional revenue. That would either be through the growth in the digest, if we leave the millage rate where it is, and the digest contract, once they do the final digest and do all the appeals. If there's an increase at that time, then that would generate additional revenue, or we would have to do a millage rate increase. Right now, the quarter millage rate reduction equates to about $2.5 million in revenue that we're giving up. So if we were to increase for every quarter meal, it would be an additional $2.5 million if you're looking at, okay, how much would a meal be? So it would be about $10 million for a meal if we wanted to increase and add anything. Other things that we could do is eliminate some items in the budget and reallocate those funds to the new requests that you would like. Or we can use reserves for one-time non-recurring expenditures like capital items and extraordinary expense that may occur, any catastrophic occurrences.
Go back over that again.
On the fund balance?
No,
Yep.
things that you said, if you wanted to.
If we wanted to add anything to the budget would require additional revenue.
Right.
So one of the things we could do, it would be through growth in the digest. So if the values increased even more at the current proposed millage rate, that would generate a little more revenue. Or you could increase the millage rate. Again, we reduced it by 0.25. That's the proposal. That 0.25 is equal to $2.5 million. So a full meal would be equal to $10 million. So when we're looking at adding things, we would need to look at if we would need to increase the millage rate or reallocate items. So in other words, take out some of the things that we currently have in the budget and reallocate those funds to something else.
Okay, how would that change?
How it won't change. So for instance, I just put this out. So some of the pay increases that were given, say for instance the merit increase and some of the new positions, if we took some of those out, then that would free up some money to reallocate to other items in the budget if you wanted to add something to the budget.
Commissioner Franklin, you have something?
Yes, I think that would be the case if we were only looking at those few items. But first of all, thank you for your presentation of the budget. And secondly, I've stated on this board a couple times, because other jurisdictions are doing it, there are other options. If we look at just where we are and you look at only salaries and we got to cut this and cut that, then of course that sounds very scary to people, and then they're okay with a millage rate going up. But there are a couple of areas that have always concerned me about where we spend money. And I believe Madam Vice Chair even brought it up. We employ people in positions where we have to go out and hire people to do jobs. That's one area that is of concern. The other area is, some time ago, I believe it was PD and Fire gave us a presentation, and we're still behind. 10% when we pushed for it to be on the agenda to get it moved forward, it was with the understanding, as I've sent to you all as with emails, that we still need to get to that 13%. And I've said it over and over again, if we're not taking care of those who are our first responders, all the rest of this stuff is not as important at the end of the day, except for the COLAs and so forth. But when we're constantly spending money out for services, that's an issue for me. And secondly, I think that we can dig a little deeper into finding out means that we can use this ARPA funding to be able to offset some of that. And then lastly, I'm going to say it as I stated before, and it was presented before us. Every other jurisdiction around us is no longer growing their community off the backs of the current citizens, which, as we see here, off the taxpayers. Every other community has what's in place called, they call them impact fees. Clayton County doesn't have anything but the water impact fees. And so therefore, every firefighter, every police officer, every deputy, basically outside of the fire fund, we're having to build new facilities and provide them with all the equipment and services. Majority of that is still off of the burden of the back of the citizens. So we are really behind the time. So I could tell you, for me in this budget, as much as I want to support it, if it doesn't have those elements in it, I don't know that I could support it. I think there's more that we can do there. Even if we look at, for the first year, that we're going to be able to offset funding, move that funding directly from the ARPA that can be qualified, and put it in there and assign it between 2024 and 2026. By that time, according to Chief, if you could tell me real quick again, how long is it going to take to stand up that the impact fees? You gave us that presentation some time ago. How long will it take?
11 months from the day the board says go.
11 months. And we've drug our feet. So I don't think that we're doing everything that we can. So that's just where I am on this budget. And then the other thing is with the SPLOST. The SPLOST funding, particularly down in the River's Edge area, they've heard over and over again as the SPLOST is collected, we were going to do this or that with that clubhouse. Lots of promises there. And they've just not been fulfilled. So this is a good presentation, but I think we've got a long way to go as a board to be able to do what we're here to do, which is to be a good fiduciary over the taxpayer's dollar.
All right, and
Okay, I'm not
got a
through.
response? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, no, duly
I was
noted.
about to say the
Yeah, but I need to
presentation
finish.
isn't over
And
yet,
that, no,
so.
it's not over. And Mr. Johnson is gonna, you weren't here, Commissioner, when we started. Mr. Johnson is gonna give an update on the public safety, as you requested, and some potential options to do that. But as you stated, some of them may not be preferable to you, but we have looked at some things, and he's gonna present that part. So I'm gonna finish
Awesome.
this part, and then let him do his, and then we'll take questions and comments from either the board or the audience. So where was I? Oh, we talked about, okay. So on the, this just shows the history of our revenues, expenditures, and fund balance history. And I have to look over here. The fund balance has continued to grow since 2013, except for 2015. We had a slight decrease there. And then in 16, 17, 18, it has grown. You see a significant increase from 17 to 18, and that was from the funding that the state gave us for the aviation fuel. And we're just now starting to use some of that money to pay for some of the pay enhancements for public safety.
How much is
And,
still left there, if you don't mind me? So I won't forget.
How much more money we have left in there, Janice, do you know, off the top of your head? So we have, right now, about 10
And
million.
how much did we originally have?
18,
And how much were they compensating us for in terms of funding for how many years? When we
3
received it?
years.
3 years,
3
when we
years.
originally received it when?
Yes,
It's residing in our fund balance.
it's in the fund balance.
When did we originally receive it was my question. I'm sorry.
2018?
2018.
Yes.
Fiscal year 2018.
Okay, thank you. And why are we holding on to
So-
that again?
Well, we're not holding on to it, we just hadn't had to use it yet, because we've had adequate revenue. Now, if the board so please, last year, we did use some of it when we reduced the millage rate. We used some of the fund balance to reduce the millage rate. And if that's the board's purview, we'll be happy, we can do that, is to use it to reduce the millage rate. But we just have to make sure that in future years, when Dennis and I, when we're looking at things, we're looking at sustainability for not just 3 years from now, but 4 or 5 years from now, when we may not even be here. So, so whoever comes in behind us will not have to come in trying to find money to make us some of those things happen with here now. When I first started, some things that had been done, we had to find money to sustain it. So we can't just continue to use fund balance to sustain for those recurring expenditures. We just want to make sure we can use it maybe the first year, but we need to make sure moving out forward, we will be able to sustain those every annual expenses. Because as I stated earlier, the best practice is to use fund balance for those one-time. Fund balance is like an emergency reserve. Like you have a savings at home. We don't pay our bills from our savings account every month at home. In an emergency situation, you can, but you don't repeatedly do it, or you won't have any savings left over. So that is how an analogy to use to describe your reserves or your fund balance for those emergency items, or to reduce the millage rate. So
I don't want to interrupt y'all before you go to the next part, but your answer really doesn't quite answer what we just talked about. We received $18 million in 2018 that were applied for 3 years. It was for the lost revenue, if I'm not mistaken.
it was to replace
from the
lost
airport.
revenue. Yes.
So that money, if we'd had that money, we would have already spent that money. So I don't know that it's proper to categorize it as fund balance, because it's money we would have used, unless you all are seeing it differently.
You want to respond? Go
Why would it be
ahead.
categorized
Excuse me.
differently?
So how I categorize it is that, remember, the use of fund balance is a budgetary account only. So how do you know when you use fund balance? Your expenses are greater than your revenues.
Right.
So in that case, that's why your fund balance drops on an actual basis. So if you look in 20 to 21, we took a $7 million hit. 18 minus 7 is now
That's
the
your
10 million
11,
I'm
the
telling
10.
you is left.
Okay, I'm
And
clear on
we're
that.
We're budgeting more out of fund balance because we have that. That's just a buffer. That 18 was a buffer on top of the existing fund balance that we had.
That's
And
the
if you
point.
look back to,
Yeah.
if you kind of look back to it, you will see that. We went
So-
from 59.3 to 94.1, and that's when we got.
So if you take the $18 million off the 94, because I did that upstairs and I bring it with me, you'll see what our actual fund balance was if we didn't have that money.
So that money, if we didn't have that money, we could have already used that money. If we didn't have to get it reimbursed to us because we lost it and we would have gotten it anyway, we wouldn't have used that $18 million over the course of 3 years.
We budgeted times we anticipated using fund balance. However, the expenses were less than our revenues, and our fund balance actually
Went up,
So we
but-
didn't have we thought we were going to need it, but because with vacancies and the things we've seen trend and lower expenses prior to the pandemic, we started to see our expense levels drop, our personnel costs drop, and thus we did not need to use fund balance.
Which is something that we've discussed in past hearings. When fund balance increased, it's because we have monitored the departments have been cognizant in not spending all of their money that was budgeted. So again, when the revenues exceed our expenditures, that increases our fund balance. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, or if that's what you wanted to hear, but
Yeah, we'll go on.
Okay.
Let's go on with the presentation.
Yeah.
Come
all
back to
right.
the
So
questions.
again, good business practice dictates having at least a minimum of 1 month's operating expense in reserve. We like to have at least 3 months, kind of like we do at home, in case something happens. If something happens and they weren't able to send out tax bills, or we weren't able to get our tax revenue in, we want to make sure that we can continue to pay our bills, pay our people. That's why it's important to make sure we maintain a good level of fund balance. Also, because we don't get our tax revenue in until November and December. So our current average monthly expenditures are $18.4 million, and again, we're projecting to end the current fiscal year at $90.8 million, which will be our beginning fund balance for next year. The remaining budget calendar after today is, hopefully we can adopt the budget with any changes that may be needed on June 7th. One thing I do want to bring to your attention and make the board aware of is that we will be bringing an amendment to the proposed budget because after the budget document had been prepared and we had, Janice and staff had balanced everything, the sheriff's office had a meeting with the chairman, the COO, and myself, and we approved an additional $985,000 for the office of the sheriff. So we will be adding that to the budget to be included in the final budget in June, whenever we adopt it. And then if we have to have millage rate hearings, those will be done in July, with the final adoption in late July, early August. But that's to be determined based on what the final digest shows. So next, Mr. Johnson's going to talk about the public safety update. He's run some numbers based on some projections.
Well, hold on, before you go on to Mr. Johnson, are there any questions in reference to Ms. Bivens' presentation?
What did you say about the sheriff's office?
We need to add, so I don't know if you recall, we had meetings, after we sent back the recommended budget to the departments, all the departments that wanted to have a budget hearing with the chairman, we gave them the dates and times, they all scheduled. The sheriff's office opted not to attend. They came and did a budget hearing, a budget presentation to the board. And after I talked to them that night at the back of the room, they agreed to come and sit and talk with us the next week. So we had a meeting with them, and this is what came out of that meeting. We discussed with us which we could have done prior, and we would have been able to get it in here, but it didn't happen. So I mean, it is what it is. We met, and we got what they needed. Some things they didn't get everything they asked for, and they were okay with that. And I sent them an email with what we had discussed. They said, fine, move forward, and that's what we've done. Okay?
Mr. Johnson.
Ooh, what did I do? Oh, there you
I'm
go.
done now.
Here you go.
Thank you. All right. Good evening, Chairman, Vice Chair, Commissioners. So what I'm going to do is kind of give you an update of some of the components that we've talked about for this public safety increase, because there's some things in the budget that just concerned us. If you recall, when I presented on the 18th of January, I talked about some factors, and we're going to go through and relate some of those items specifically from that presentation to what we've seen in the budget. So the first item is the housing outlook. Since January, there's been significant changes to the housing market. Obviously, with the recent Federal Reserve activities, we're starting to see mortgage rates go through the roof for homeowners. And again, we were just starting to kind of get into our good spot where we're starting to see the additional of homes approved, and we could see that rolling forward into the future. However, now, you're looking, and some people say that affordability of homes is at an all-time low, particularly in the greater Atlanta area. Housing construction costs continue to increase from supply chain issues and labor shortages. And so what we're seeing now, where in January you would have probably looked at one thing that would have said, we think we're going to have some additional revenue down the road, even if we were to continue to trend our millage rate to the public downward. However, now we're looking at things where builders are going to be reluctant to build new homes without a seller. Before, literally anything you could build and construct, you could find a seller for, because the demand was that high, and we were starting to see that in the south part of in our area. Expect longer days on the market for new homes. Even today, I started hearing some stuff. Traffic's 50% lower because, again, what you're seeing is mortgages are starting to challenge people, not just the interest rate aspect and the price aspect, but also the inflation aspect on other parts of their own expenses. As supply increases, it went up slightly, 2.5%. Again, as CFO Bivens discussed, supply and demand, but in this case, even if the pressure upward, you get a bigger supply, we're still not going to see that supply dwindle because of the cost of that. There are going to be fewer qualified buyers due to higher rates, and we're not going to see that much initially, or from what we can tell right now, in one piece that's going to help this public safety scenario. So I've run through a couple scenarios. I got some new housing outlooks from Mr. GK of different types. So what I did is I'm taking these different types of homes. And so for just purposes, we used roughly a $220,000 average price, combining townhomes and homes. That, again, we don't know what the market's going to bear right now. But if you do that, that adds about $190 million to the tax digest. And when you use 40% assessed value for 14.496, you're looking at $1.1 million, which is a nice chunk to add to what we're trying to do. But again, now you're questioning how you're going to see that money come in, where you would have probably in a 12, 15, 18-month period seen those homes completed and be fully valued on the digest. Now we're anticipating that as they stay in construction and they may start homes or have stoppages in some of the homes due to supply chain issues, that period may go to 24, 36 months before a subdivision is built out. So then I also looked at the apartments because I didn't really have a great way to value, but I worked with the tax assessor's office to use roughly, based on income, what the assessed value of an apartment is. And so that adds about $150,000 average value. That adds about $120 million to the tax digest, and that yields about almost $700,000. And what we can anticipate is future new revenue due to growth on the digest. And so while that is good, I'm not sure I have anything substantial to base it on in next fiscal year and maybe even part of after that fiscal year due to all the other elements that we're seeing. This budget was very surprising because, again, when we went back, we talked about the 10%. And we did 5%. This was effective 4/30 of 22. This week's paycheck should, for the first responders, have that first 5% in it. Again, sworn non-first responders, 5%, and the remaining public safety and remaining everyone else, again, this is just public safety, is 3%. So the budget includes a merit increase of about almost $2.4 million. And again, for public safety employees, in the range of the salaries for the folks that we're really targeting, we're looking at roughly 3.75 is what those individuals in the $40,000 to $80,000 range will have. So those folks can earn 3.75 additional on top of the 10%, and that's built into the budget as it's presented. So this brings the average increase to them about 13.75%. But to be very candid, let's remember that that's based on somebody's anniversary date. So if you're a July anniversary date, you're happy, you're going to get the raise all 12 months. If you're in June, you're going to get 1/12 of that, or about 0.33 increase for the fiscal year. That's just the way the merit process works. To reach an additional 10%, we need $10.3 million every fiscal year moving into the future. Again, and this is going to require ongoing funding. So if you look at it, inflation, COVID-19, supply chain issues have impacted the county. We took some of the cost increases were enormous, 7.5%, $7.5 million additional from what we've been running and trending over the past several years. That's pretty much could have been the best hope, because the revenues that we received from the digest and things, as we continue to try to lower the rate, were sufficient to do the funding had we not continued to run into some of these enormous cost increases. I talked to the financial leaders all over the state and locally, and they are all seeing the same thing, particularly in the construction area where you're doing renovations and projects. They're getting notices of amendments to bids that they've already finalized. Because they're seeing such drastic increases in lumber, and you all know this. The other side, so that was one of the big things that took a resource out of us that could have been applied to the public safety aspect. The millage rate reduction, as CFO Bivens talked about earlier, was about $2.5 million. Again, part of our goal was to share the decrease and the continued downward trend in the millage rate to the public. So also, if you recall, I talked about what new positions, again, would do to our could do to our, as we add additional positions. We have $1.7 million in new positions with that and some of the reclasses that are built into the budget. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the merit cost is $2,355,014. The other item in there is an effort to bring all the part-time rate up to $15 an hour. And that cost is almost $1.8 million by itself. And then for full-time employees, there was a certain small portion of full-time employees who were either new or on lower end of the scale that needed to be moved up to $15 an hour. So if you see, there's an enormous amount of funding going out for the entire workforce of Clayton County. So I think as Ms. Bivens talked about, you know, in order for us to really get the kind of increase that you want, we're going to have to find a place and choose where we want to reduce costs. I don't see a great something large that we can count on initially due to the current market that's going to allow us to see additional revenue. And while I hope that somebody will initiate some legislation for impact fees, again, that offset is typically in infrastructure costs. So, and those primarily are borne by SPLOST already. So they're not in the general fund. So while that will be good, I don't see a direct offset dollar for dollar to costs that we would see directly for our ability to invest in public safety increases. The other thing is, which is to forego the millage rate reduction, that would get you a quarter of the way there. I think really what we're looking at, and I think I mentioned this to begin with, it's going to be an incremental thing. I don't see a home run coming out of any one area. I mean, I've looked at this budget inside and out. When I looked at the first 25 cost increases that the county got by line item expense, that was over $15.4 million. So there are some other things we were able to offset, but the inflation challenges are staggering right now. Nothing like I've ever seen, and I lived through the early 80s. So my recommendation right now is to look at costs or programs that you think we can put aside and incrementally work our way there and reevaluate it mid-year. I think we need to look at these areas that have been presented, and if you want an amendment, you know, we will certainly calculate that and what it would mean and what we could do for the public safety first responders. Now questions.
All right, any questions?
Uh,
Yes. Commissioner Hammond.
You mentioned the percentage of what an increase would be for a person with a salary of 80,000. Now, what
40.
would that percentage?
That was 40 to 80.
40 to 80 is
40 to 80.
40 to 80 is 3.75 for those individuals in that range.
Okay.
For those above 80, the maximum they could get is 2.5%.
Okay.
So it was increased over where it has been by a small amount, but mostly in the middle amounts to make sure that people in the public safety range would be able to get the maximum benefit out of that. And then those on the lower end would get the highest of 5%.
Okay. And at one point, we mentioned these positions that we have, we're funding them, but they have not been filled.
Correct.
Did we ever say what we were going to do with those after so many
What we typically do in that case is we're in a position right now where we use some of that savings and we know that we'll see some decreased costs. Mm-hmm. So the issue with that is the biggest dollars, you know, after you take out the constitutional officers and those that are elected officials, then you're left with certain departments. The vast majority of the vacancies are in public safety. So we're not in a position to take away positions to give them a raise at this point.
Oh, no, that wasn't.
Yeah, no, I understand. I understand. But what we have done is utilize, as I said, in the presentation back in January, we were going to use about $3.5 million of vacancies.
Right.
And we can continue to do that. But the other thing I caution is we have new positions that have been added that's going to make that, and those may get filled, but we have to really look at our overall manning and how we want to approach staffing throughout the county and not budget these, because to an extent there's a little bit of inflation in your head count and then you're taking it away. But you want something that you can really count on to make sure that these increases stay with our public safety individuals.
Commissioner Franklin.
I do.
Hold on, Commissioner Franklin.
Thank you again, Dennis, for your presentation. I'm actually looking at the data right now from several brokers. And I don't know if the board remember, but there used to be a guy by the name of Eugene James he's like the guru of the market in the Atlanta region when it comes to housing. And but based upon what the brokers are actually seeing out in the market, they don't see the market slowing down in any capacity. I just double checked that.
Okay.
And so, in fact, someone just stated that their Northbridge Estates, they got 25 offers on one house with the inflation rate. Because what's happening is people are coming in paying cash for houses. So that's one of the things that, even though we wish that may not have been the case, but you got to remember that this market, people are still purchasing. You got the baby boomers that are retiring. They're moving out of busy areas such as New York, the Miamis, the California, and they're coming to Georgia as we see the trend. They're no longer going to Florida because they're tired of hurricanes, but they're coming here and they're using their retirement. In fact, I talked to a gentleman down in the Lovejoy area. He moved out of just Atlanta and said, I use my 401k to buy my house, which is my largest expense. But this is what's really happening and trending. Now, I appreciate the information coming from what we're seeing, but I think that what we have to do is look at it overall. And so I like what you have stated and what you presented to us, but I still stay and hold fast to the fact that we can do a little bit more. And I heard Vice Chair mentioning about the 40 to the 80,000. Somewhat, what I would really like to see that I've seen with the pay increase. Number one, I'd like to see us go ahead and find the extra, now that you're seeing it's 13.75% on average. We still need to find 10%, because once Gwinnett, if they do provide that extra bonus to their first responders, then we will be the lowest paid in the metro Atlanta area. I've been watching it very, very closely. And I've talked to the commissioners up in Gwinnett. I don't know how close they are. But I believe that there's a way that this board can take a look at not just the 40 to 80,000. I think that's a broad range. You know, there's a total difference in the income of 40,000 versus 80,000 if we're averaging that together. I believe that we'll see a better picture of really where the difference is, with possibly doing the higher of the 5% upwards to about 55,000 because of the inflation. Yeah. I'm not saying that we can. I'm only asking for models so that we can take a look to see what it would look like.
Yeah, I can actually do a model, because with merit, it's not the percentage increase. We take the groups, we take all the salaries that are in the budget, we sort them by dollar amount, we take this dollar amount, we say they can go up to 5%. But the key thing is, as I mentioned earlier, that the anniversary date. So it's not a pure 5% times all those salaries.
Got it.
It's 5% times 1/12, 2/12 all the way through. So it's roughly 60 cents on the dollar on average based on what we have in employees and anniversary dates. So we have it very finite. So,
right.
We can do the same thing. What I would encourage us to do is to lay out the priority of what you'd like to see us do first. We have 3 weeks between the adoption and, we're looking to advertise the adoption tomorrow and get it in the paper on the 25th for adoption on the 7th. So we have 3 weeks where we can have some scenarios that are worked up and provide those. I think we're also looking at, I don't think there's anybody in this state that looks at ARPA as hard as I do. Trust me. And I have reached out to colleagues and they haven't even spent their $10 million.
Right.
And it's not committed to public safety, which staggered me. I've talked to one county, we used ARPA money here, and I have some people that said, no, we're not going to. This is for projects that people want to do in the community. And I was very surprised.
Well, I'm surprised because I'm going to Walton County now, and these commissioners are telling me exactly what's going on.
Yeah, and again, I think it's a great use, that $10 million.
Yeah.
What I am trying to do is leverage as much of the ARPA as I can. The issue is I'm limited to the $10 million right now. But I have heard some inklings out of Washington allowing that maybe they want us to try to use some of it for public safety increases. However, they haven't said, oh yeah, you can go beyond the $10 million that we've given you already. So that's to be determined. I think we're trying to get some clarity about whether that's going to be valid or not. But certainly we want to do everything we can to, it really allows us all to solve a problem. If we can solve one problem, we can go on to the next. And I know this is a big problem for everybody. So we'll certainly consider any scenario that you would like to work.
So your answer is all the reason why we need to look at modeling, making that 5% increase up to the 55,000, at
Yep.
least 50 to 55, because of the inflation, and because you're so meticulous, and because it's the 10th and the 60th is 60%, 60. You said 60 cents on the
58
dollar
point
and so
something,
much.
yeah.
So that's more of a
You get,
reason why we
you
can do
get
that.
good leverage that way.
Yeah, every little bit helps, you know.
It does. It does.
So, all right, thank you.
Commissioner Davis.
Yes, I have a question dealing with the expenditures,
Uh-huh.
which is, I know the supply chain costs are going to be increasing. Have we put inside any type of factor for these expenditures to be, if we have to begin to adjust them based on these oil, these lumber, these gasoline prices going
Well,
up?
again, if you think about the day-to-day maintenance that comes from buildings and maintenance that is funded by the general fund, some of those are contractual, some of those are as needed. It's the larger projects that come out of a separate fund, the SPLOST, the capital projects funds, where I think you're really going to start to see those increases. However, if you really think about what we're building, we're looking at a new admin building. We're looking at several fire stations, fire station renovations. We will have to deal with those change orders as they come. We have been seeing them all and all, but do we have a factor built in? I didn't have the leverage to build a factor in during this time.
I'm just thinking because even for our first responders on fuel costs,
Right.
tire costs, we're going to have to begin to look at
Everything.
that, and those are going to begin to rise as well.
When we reached out to Mr. Matarco, and he advised us where he was at this fiscal year, we immediately went into the budget and amended the budget prior to balancing to ensure that we raised those costs in our budget to reflect where we were today. Yeah. Yeah, we used those. We had to use fund balance for those. If you recall the last meeting, we had a budget amendment for that because it's that urgent.
Commissioner Davis.
Yes.
Is it on? Oh, yeah. Okay. Those are some. So when I was talking about the one-time use of fund balance, those are some of the things, those extraordinary items that you could use that for.
Okay.
Like if we're in the middle of, Mr. Johnson said, we did that this year when we came with the budget amendment to increase because of the increase in fuel costs. So if we see some things like that continue, then we may come back to the board to say, listen, we're seeing some more increases, and again, that's that savings account that we have to handle those things like that.
Thank you. And also my next question, dealing with the staffing, and I guess this is not really for budgetary, but just kind of an open statement that we possibly need to begin to look at technology and how we can begin to utilize technology to begin to increase our efficiency, or sometimes, and I hate to say it, but even begin to do jobs on a greater scale. So in all departments. So we might need to begin to look at that and increase our technology budget for that to begin to go out to look for these robust systems.
Any other questions?
No, one other additional. We know that we're a majority minority community, and I just want to make sure that I cover all bases. And I just got back from NARAB, which is the National Association of Realtors, and they too are stating that it is more realistic for selling prices from sellers. The buyers were moved to adjustable rate mortgages with caps until the war lets up. There absolutely will not be a market crash. And then on top of that, what's happening is it's just going to offset the rise that we're seeing in terms of the pricing. Like people were seeing inflated values, and so that's going to balance out more so than people stopping building, because according to both of these brokers who are Claytonians, and are in this particular market in Clayton County, they're saying that no, it's not slowing down at all.
Yeah,
They're going to continue to build because there's not enough product on the market.
that is, as I talked
Even
about the
inflation.
supply, two things. The adjustable rate mortgages with inflation are still very, very high for people, because even they've moved up the adjustable rates higher than they probably should be, given the current situation. We know those rates will continue to rise because the Fed is already on target for 0.5% all the way through the end of the year, until we get to almost 3.25%, 3.5%. The other thing is home builders nationally, the indexes that they use to look at different components all dramatically dropped. It was in CNBC this morning, and the outlook is not what it was even a few months ago. I think Clayton County will still have some selling, which would be okay, but over time, the affordability, because not everybody's coming down from up north to be able to pay cash for a home, which would be great, but you're going to see people need to get payments, and what's impacting it, maybe not the mortgage itself, but it's all these other cost increases that they're seeing in their life. When they look, somebody said it's a 40% increase on a monthly payment for people if you include inflation of operating costs. That's a sizable amount for anybody's budget.
Just the final part of that debate, I think what's been our Achilles heel in Clayton is we were the last to come out of the market.
I think you're right.
And that's
I think
our
you're absolutely-
Achilles heel, but it's also going to turn around to be our greatest asset. So when
hope
we're
so.
looking at CNBC again, that's why I tend to, I study the market, but I still tend to look at the folks who were doing transactions here. And Clayton is, as you saw, I think I sent the article to everybody. Man, we are on fire. People are wanting to come here and build.
That would be good.
It's happening.
All right, Ms. Bivens, you advised that we can take questions from the audience during this.
Nobody signed up.
Okay,
That's what I asked him to bring this. He said the one guy
Gotcha.
signed up, it was for the regular board meeting.
regular
so-
board meeting.
Yes.
All right, so let me just say that I appreciate the both of your efforts in helping to present a balanced budget. We sat down at the table and you rubbed your heads quite often and really wondered where money was going to come from, but I think y'all did a excellent job in making some recommendations and presented us with some options. So I appreciate all that you've done in that space, and we look forward to adopting, if not this or some version of it, after you present us with some other modeling, and then we'll move forward. So at that time, I appreciate it. Thank you, and we stand adjourned.